Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5, verse 5, NKJV. This verse has been the object of much discussion throughout church history. Coming from the Beatitudes in the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, this 5th verse fits well with some of the other seemingly counterintuitive statements that Jesus lays forth in the broader passage. Some look at this verse and are repulsed by it. Those who examine this verse in a hurried, passing manner often come away from it feeling sad for the Christian. Their thought might be something like, "Poor Christian, his God expects him to be weak. Not only that, but the Christian God even promises blessing for the Christian's embodiment of weakness." Though this interpretation is understandable, given the popular connotation of the word meek, it is likely a flawed and misguided interpretation. The biblical usage of the word translated as meek in Matthew 5:5 is something like gentleness of spirit or mildness of disposition. Though these definitions may not immediately conjure up in the mind images of strength and confidence, I would argue they ought not conjure up images of weakness. It seems logical to me that in order for someone to be termed gentle, he would need to at least have the ability to be the opposite of gentle. Someone cannot be gentle if they are incapable of being anything but gentle. In that case, they would simply be weak and not gentle. When applied to an individual, the word gentle seems to contain within it an implicit praise which says, "You have conducted yourself well, you have acted mildly, though we as the observing world are well aware that you have the potential to act violently." If this distinction is not clear, let me make another attempt to clarify it. Gentle seems to be a positive term, which speaks of some ethical or moral good. If someone is incapable of acting in any other way than in a manner which could roughly be termed as gentle, they are not gentle in actuality, because the inability to do wrong or act violently is not ethically or morally good, but rather is ethically or morally neutral. One can only be praised for his good conduct if he also has the ability to conduct himself badly. It is senseless to praise someone for good conduct if they are incapable of anything but good conduct. Regarding the second gloss offered for the word translated as meek in Matthew 5, this idea of mildness of disposition needs to be dealt with in a slightly different manner. To say that one has a mild disposition is not necessarily to offer them praise for a consciously decided state, but it is to praise them for being found less severe in qualities of mind and character when compared to other individuals. This is praise that is directed toward one's inherent being and not toward one's conscious conduct. It must be pointed out, however, that like in our explanation of the first definition, this praise for having a mild disposition only has meaning when there is an opposite state of inherent being to compare it to. If there only existed in the world people of mild disposition, it would be utterly meaningless to praise them for this inherent mildness. Without the existence of differences and opposites, comparisons are rendered utterly impossible and meaningless. Hidden within this whole argument, of course, is the assumption that a mild disposition is somehow better than a severe disposition. I will say this. Mildness of disposition seems to be better than a severity of disposition, in that one who is prone to mildness is able to exist more stably in the face of a volatile world. Someone who is more prone to severity of disposition, however, seems to be more susceptible to the caustic poison of the ever-changing world. Now that we have seen how meekness is not necessarily synonymous with weakness, let us examine a theory of semantics and etymology that could serve to further this point. Matthew 5:5 in the Greek reads like this: Makarioi hoi praes, hoti autoi kleronomesusen tein gen. The word praes is the word that is typically translated in Matthew 5:5 as meek. In a simpler form, this word can be transliterated praus. There are multiple sources that suggest that this word praus was used in the realm of Greek warfare to refer to the process by which war horses were trained to be consistent, fearless, and mighty instruments in battle. The idea here is that a powerful, spirited horse could be trained to control that power and spirit in order to effectively move toward a desired end. The horses needed to be powerful in order to endure the horrors of battle, but they also needed to be disciplined or meek in order to use that power productively. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a large body of evidence to substantiate this claim, but if this claim is true, it would give an even richer meaning to Jesus' statement, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." If Jesus was indeed using this warfare terminology as his framework, the idea that he would be putting forth here is something like this: "Blessed are those who control their power, for they will inherit the earth." Suddenly, the statement can no longer be mistaken by a passerby as weakness, but rather can only be seen as a reasoned showing of strength. There is one final perspective from which I would like to view this idea of meekness. Unfortunately, I might lose the attention of some of my Christian readers here, because of a strange prejudice that has taken root and grown up far and wide within the walls of religious institutions, particularly Christian institutions. The perspective that I would like to end with is the perspective of shadow integration as laid out by the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung. The strange prejudices that I will be working against here are the prejudice that Christians seem to have against thinkers like Jung, Freud, and Nietzsche, and the prejudice that some Christians have against the disciplines of psychology and philosophy in general. While it is true that Jung, Freud, and Nietzsche were all either critical of religion or purported versions of religious belief that would be largely foreign to ordinary lay people of faith, this, in my mind, does not give us the right to dismiss their ideas, nor to dismiss them as thinking people. And if the God of Christianity is real, then there is no idea, perspective, or discipline that could topple him from his heavenly throne. We can, in fact, learn some very helpful things if we can find it within our hearts to truly listen to people and consider what they have to say. There does have to be a word of caution spoken here, however. Though God's reality may be fixed and unshakable, there are men and women who are very easily intellectually shaken, and who are too easily swayed by everything they hear. Indeed, there are those who take as unequivocally true the first argument they hear, not leaving room for consideration of any other kind. These kinds of people need to be very careful in any arena of discussion. I cannot say what the best defenses against unmerited belief are, but I must simply issue the plea: think about what you believe, and make your thinking a group effort. Now that I have made the proper preparations, let us get to Jung's idea of shadow integration and how this idea could have much to say about the biblical idea of meekness. It ought to be said that I am no expert in the field of Jungian psychology or Jungian psychoanalytics, but from what I have read of Jung, the following discussion of Jung's idea of the shadow seems to me to have tremendous resonance with the biblical idea of meekness. If we grant that the wartime definition of praus is legitimate, Jung's idea of the shadow and shadow integration seem to fit very well with Jesus' idea of meekness. To Jung, the shadow is the part of the human psyche which is characterized as being largely unconscious. One's shadow is that which exists behind his public persona and behind his conscious ego. Jung's idea of the shadow seems to be made up of both good and bad elements, but regardless of their moral orientation, all elements of the shadow start out as unconscious. The shadow, being an unconscious part of the self, can in many cases become somewhat problematic. Even though the shadow exists in the unconscious, it is still an integral part of the human psyche. This means that if one does not examine himself and attempt to bring to light the unconscious shadow, he could find himself in a type of unconscious slavery to the shadow, in which the shadow is enacting its will upon the individual without the conscious consent of the individual as a whole. In other words, someone who does not endeavor to illuminate his own unconscious and shadowy biases, prejudices, desires, and dreams may at some point find himself serving the ends of those prejudices and dreams without having realized until that point that he was doing so. Jung says this of the shadow, and I quote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions." This type of unconscious slavery is especially dangerous when it incorporates the bad or evil side of the shadow. David Schoen has this to say about the shadow, and I quote, "In these ways, the personal shadow reinforces, encourages, and becomes dependent upon the addictive behavior to express itself, to have any existence in the light outside of the closet, the attic, and the basement where it has been locked up and hidden for so long. Often the addictive behavior allows the personal shadow the only opportunities to live and to be." End quote. It is possible that the non-illumination or suppression of the shadow is what makes alcoholics of otherwise good fathers, drug addicts of otherwise good mothers, and perverse murderers of ordinary men. Jung's theory of how to deal with the potentially destructive shadow is that one ought to do his best to identify his shadowy side and consciously integrate it into his life in socially acceptable ways. For instance, if one's shadow houses within it tendencies of violent aggression, the individual ought to identify this aggression and then find ways to healthily channel it into socially appropriate endeavors or actions. Maybe the individual could stand to be more assertive and self-motivated. These would be good avenues through which the individual could channel his pent-up aggression so as to be productive and not destructive. The attentive reader has no doubt already seen the correlation between Jung's idea of shadow integration and our assumed definition of biblical meekness. Just as the idea of meekness in Matthew 5 could be seen as strength or power under control, Jung's idea of shadow integration could be seen as the process by which we take the untamed power within ourselves and bring it under our conscious control so that it can be productively channeled toward a good end. What Jung seems to be describing and championing in his idea of shadow integration is the concept of meekness. If we can grasp this striking similarity, we are well on our way to understanding how meekness is not at all a characteristic of the weak, but of the mighty. Just as it takes tremendous strength for one to examine himself in all of his twisted and shadowy glory, and to work at unwinding his twists and illuminating his shadows for good, so it also takes tremendous strength to restrain and tame his inner powerful self so as to consistently and undauntedly march toward a better and more triumphant existence.